All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. If you want to have a little fun, laugh some steam, relax, ensuring you don't become homicidally enraged, hear voices, attempt to stalk and kill your loved ones, perhaps you'd like to play fantasy esports at Alpha Draft. They have League of Legends, Dota 2, CSGO, Smite, bunch of online stuff, bunch of leagues, tons of different tournaments, free ones, pay a little bit, pay a lot. Link in the description box below. Sunde was just announced as the second member of this new mTw team. And the first member was Minette, someone he'd played with he'd played with in mTw in 2010. And so both of these players are Danish players who were in the famous mTw.dk lineup, or one of them, at least the 2010 lineup. And his return is actually quite exciting because first and foremost, he's someone where in 2014, while I worked at On Gamers, I did an article which was like 10 players who would have been really good at CSGO, or something along those lines. And the idea was I took like great 1.6 players who I thought if they'd have played CSGO, these guys have been monsters. And he was on the list. In fact, I think he was reasonably high up, maybe like number 4 or something. So he's someone who I thought had the skill set to do so, and I'll kind of get into that. But it's key to know who he is because he is one of the all-time great 1.6 players, but also people sometimes maybe go a bit too far when they're describing his skill set. So I'll kind of get into some of that. So he's someone who started out, and the first time he really came into sort of the public consciousness of people who watch international tournaments would only have actually been about 2007. Before that, he was just playing within the Danish scene, and actually his history is he originally made a team called Mirror with a friend of his called Envy, actually. And then they got Ave to play with them, who would obviously later on go to be on his legendary in-game leader within the mTw lineups. But Ave then got an offer. It was actually from a team called X and Ferris. He went over and joined that team. But the two players, Ave and Sunde, would go and rejoin again in a team called Evermore. And these teams were all sort of like, like 3rd, 4th, 5th level best teams in Denmark, battling around there, going to Danish lands, battle IT, slap, but never going to the big international tournaments. In Evermore, though, Sunde actually got to go to his first like proper international land. It wasn't really a big one, it was just a small one, which was the rendezvous lands that they used to have in Sweden. And really all you'd do there is just play against Swedish mixed teams of some of the good players, but usually not like really proper teams in general. Then what happened is Ave left again. Ave went to Spirit of Amiga, SOA, which was like the second best team at the time. And then along came Sunde again. He rejoined Ave there because they would have a very close relationship over the years. And they obviously both recognized that each player was good in his respective roles. Then Ave left again. Ave went over to play in NOA, where he was playing with this all Danish lineup, and it had, Zonic, had HPX. And he was playing in this team, and they'd had like okay results. They managed to face like 4th at World Cyber Games in 2006. But in 2007, they made the move to bring Sunde in. And what's interesting is at the time, Sunde was pretty much exclusively just a rifle player, known for his Silence Colt. And at this tournament, ESWC was one of the majors. We had the majors was like the big IEM final, ESWC, and World Cyber Games. Those are generally the 3 big majors. At this major, the then NOA team managed to make this run to the final. They beat MIBR, the champions of the last year, in an incredible semi-final that was really close, particularly the Inferno game. They made it to the final, but there they played Pentagram. And this is when Neo really was in the peak of his powers. I mean, it lasted a long time, but this is when he really was in full-on God mode, and that team was very, very good at the time. The first half of the year, they dominated. And so they won the major. Famously, Sunde and NOA had to settle for the silver medal here. But Sunde even had a round during this tournament where he had a Deagle round that was like a crazy set of kills. I think it was even in this final on Inferno. And he became known for that because if you make a huge, memorable, big play in a big major, more people are going to see it. There's going to be more eyes on it, and you get put in all the frag movies. And so, people start to talk about this guy. Oh, he's what a great player. And obviously, him joining NOA was like a key part to transforming them from a team that would come like top 4 or maybe make the quarterfinals into like a team that was now contending for titles. They won some smaller lands, like some Euro Cups. But then the last major of the year, the World Cyber Games, this was the one where, as I mentioned in the Who is Zonic video, a lot of the top teams got upset there. Fnatic, the Poles, Virtus Pro, the Finns, nearly all the top teams ended up getting upset in different points. And Mouse Sports didn't have their proper lineup because some of their teams, I think God B couldn't play for them because he's technically registered as like coming from Turkey or something. So there's all these reasons as to why the top teams didn't make it that far. And in the final, NOA made it there and they had to play Emulate. Now, interestingly, Emulate had played them in the group stage and beaten them in an upset. But everyone still thought, come on, man, this is NOA. They're going to win in a best of 3 series. over this team who is a fluke team. They've never made the final of a big tournament. They've only got one really good player, this guy MSX, but it turned out MSX went ham, and actually it was an upset. They won the title, but the key thing is, because now this NOA team and Sunde had lost to, they'd lost to the Poles. That's fair enough. The Poles were clearly an all-time great team. Now they lost to this team who clearly wasn't, and it was a fluke one-off miracle run. Now everyone was saying, maybe they lack a bit of something, like they seem to not be able to like close the deal, you know. They get to the finals, they're contending, but they haven't won the big title yet. So in 2008, they were able to bring in Wimp, replacing HPX. And here's the interesting thing. The key thing about Wimp's arrival is, yes, Wimp was a fantastic team player, had formerly been a superstar player, and was a good player within MTW. And his play would have a big impact on the team. But one of the key things he did, his addition, kind of a bit like what's happened with Hiko in Team Liquid now, is him joining and taking the role he should have, moved everyone else's position around. So because they got Wimp into the team, who was a team player, and then he was more like a Crims type guy, and then they took out HPX, who'd been previously the dedicated primary AWPer, and he was like one of those slow and steady fraud Kogu style AWPers who'd set his shot up, always hold the same spot on every map, just work with certain angles, had good long range, good mid range AWPing that ensure he hit the shot. Because they took him out, actually, they moved all these positions around. MJ became more of a small site player. They moved everyone in these positions, and the key one they made was they put Sunde as the AWPer. Now, he wasn't like a dedicated AWPer style player, but this would end up being crucial to what happened, and I'll get into this later. So that year, they had an incredible year. They were the team of the year. It was one of the most competitive years, yet they were able to win Code 5. They beat Fnatic in the final there. SWC Masters Paris, they beat Fnatic in the final there. They won WEM in China. They beat Mouse Sports in the final, who's one of the teams who won the IEM earlier that year. They won the World Cyber Games gold medal. They beat SK Gaming in the final, though, who was one of the better teams of the year, like a top 5 team. And at the end of the year, they won the Recruit tournament, which was mainly just Eastern European teams. But at that point in time, you know, teams like Virtus.pro were still dangerous, certainly. So for the year, they won 4 like big titles. They had something like 7 top 4s in international tournaments. So what an incredible year for how dominant a year, of how difficult a year rather it was, how competitive it was. 2009, the first tournament, they were still on top. They won the IEM European Championship. They beat Alternate Attacks there, who had Roman, who was a beast. They won this tournament. Then, but at the global finals, though, they only finished 3rd. And here's an interesting thing that happened, okay. So the style of how they'd used Sunde in this team, which now was mTw.dk, was they would use him for these early on CT rounds. They'd put him in different spots each time. Ave would call the strat and say, like, right, we're going to put you here this time. He'd go to a certain spot, try to take an early angle for an AWP shot, or maybe even push up, like lower B tunnels or something, get a kill, then back off, and then they'd have the numbers advantage. They'd play very intelligently, one of the smartest teams, and they'd use that advantage to win the game. On T side, he'd take certain angles, take pickoffs. The key thing was he was always moving around the map. He was always in different spots. This is one of the first times I ever saw a team, because that style was just super effective. It almost changed the meta of the game at the time. The first time I ever saw a team abuse the way that MTW would move him around and stack him and overload certain sites with him and then swap him to a different site. I think it was a mixture of the Poles doing a really good job tactically on the T side of Dust 2, and unfortunately in the lower bracket match that ended up deciding 3rd place for the MTW, and also a bit of bad luck in terms of the gambles that Ave took and that Sunde took on this game, kind of costing his team because he took gambles where he ended up being on the wrong side. So what happened in this game was, on the first half, MTW won it something like 11-4 or 12-3, and they lost the second half, and they finished the game 14-16. And on CT side, I watched the POV demos from Sunde's point of view. It's the most disappointing game you'll ever see. I vividly remember this because every round on CT, remember they only need a few rounds to win, he's constantly like switching up spots, and it's like he's always on the wrong site. Whatever site he's on, whatever spot he's on, it's either they rush that spot and they just get him too early because he doesn't expect him to be coming down that direct action like the catwalk or something, or he swaps over to B and that's when they attack A from long, and you know there's no rotation time and he's the last man left and he has to save. It was so frustrating, and they lost in the worst possible fashion, so close at the end of the game and didn't make the final, and that actually was the end of their era. Beyond that, they were never the best team anymore. They were still like hovering around elite level status. They still had some odd upsets, like they did beat the dominant Fnatic team in the EPS Scandinavia final, but that was just a very small tournament. After that, they wouldn't make any finals. They would, towards the end of the year, MG and Wimp actually retired, and they brought in Trace and Minette, and they won the bronze at WCG with this new lineup, but again, they weren't going to win the title. 2010, now they came back to being a force again. Now they were like the 2nd or 3rd best team in the world with the chance to win big tournaments, but actually they'd only win 1 big tournament over the year because they had to keep facing this Na'Vi team every time in bracket stage, and they always they lost 100% of their best of threes against Na'Vi. In fact, their lineup would only in history win something mad like 3 out of 21 maps they played against Na'Vi. It was unreal what Kryptonite Na'Vi were for them. And the problem was, the only tournament they won was DreamHack Summer, and that's the one tournament where they didn't have to face Na'Vi in the bracket because SK upset Na'Vi in a couple of overtime games in the quarterfinals, and they just beat SK and won the tournament. So they had a number of good placings, but they always got beaten in this sense. And they lost, one of the worst ones is they lost in the final of the World Cyber Games, had to get the silver medal in like triple overtime on the third map, which is Train, and they lost in that particular fashion. So at the end of 2010, towards the end at least, it was announced that Sunde would retire, and in came, it was Arcadian they took in, and they made a different lineup. In 2011, mTw was still a good team, but they were a different type of team because Sunde had gone. Now, interestingly, there'd also been a weird period at the end of 2009, where Sunde actually took a couple of months off, even though the pro scene was still going on. They had big tournaments, DreamHack Winter, Arblet Cup Europe, and he actually took a few months and went to like Brazil or South America and just was traveling with friends and having partying and having a cool time, which is quite interesting because he then did come back and play the next year as a full year again. So it's quite a unique storyline in that particular sense. Now, the thing about Sunde was, he was originally a rifle player. So he had good rifles, he had a good deagle, as I mentioned already, but then he moved over to this AWPing style, and he had a really fast AWPing style. Like he would just take he wouldn't take the super narrow shot like angle like you see in CSGO like a Guardian. He'd take a normal angle, but he'd be like super fast flicking onto the guy. And he would also, on CT side, set up a lot of tripwire shots where he'd have a certain spot where you had to get into this position, you have to walk past his crosshair, and he just fires when you go in front of the crosshair. He keeps the crosshair stable, and he lets you tripwire, as it were. As you set off, and as with a tripwire bomb or whatever, as you hit the line, that's when the bomb goes off. So that was his style in terms of some of the CT picks. And on T side, he would go in, he'd get a quick pick, like famously on Inferno, so mTw was amazing there, and then they'd have the numbers advantage, they'd outplay you. On CT side, he'd get the pick, and he'd never like challenge and gamble and die and throw the advantage back. He'd get the pick, he'd back off, they'd have the numbers advantage, they'd win the game. And so what's key is, it was a mixture of what he could do with his skill set, knowing he wasn't some god AWPer, but knowing the skill set of what he can hit, what shots he can hit, and how to get the jump on people and how to surprise people, because this team was a tactical team, so they did their work on where they could set him up. Once they had that advantage, using Sunde and Ave's understanding of each other's game for so long, they would transition that into an advantage for the team, and that's why they were so dominant and so consistent, finishing top 4 all the time. But it meant, unfortunately, because he was so effective, I used to say this, okay, in 2008, he wasn't the best player in the world. The best player in the world probably was still a Neo or some player along this caliber, you know, Forrest, incredible individual players. Instead, Sunde was the most effective player because the way his team used him, his kills were incredibly high impact and would be transitioned into leads, into bigger leads, into wins for the team, and that's why they were such a good team. So he was someone where it's all about how he interacted with his team concept and the individual in-the-game leader. It wasn't just like a great AWPer you put there, sit in one spot, and he just kills everyone, Skadoodle style. It wasn't that style. In fact, that's why I always think of Sunde every time I think of these players now, like Guardian, like Skadoodle, where sometimes they do just sit in one spot and the enemy just goes and attacks the other side and they can have no impact on the game. And the in-game leader doesn't have such a direct influence over what they do and doesn't try to move them around and use them tactically on CT side to shut down what the other guy's going to do, because I think that's a very interesting thing in terms of the meta game that Sunde, Ave and mTw taught us using his career. So as a result, he's a player who did accomplish a lot. Yeah, they didn't win so much in 2010 or towards 2009 end. Yeah, they weren't winning titles, but they won so much in 2008. They always were top teams from 2007 to 2010 with him in the lineup. So we're talking like 3.5 years for him. Really impressive stuff. Clearly one of the greatest players, especially because of how he worked his talent into making his team better in all senses. And he'd come from being a rifler over to being an AWPer, and he was very successful. So absolutely a fantastic player. And I would love to see him in CSGO, because that kind of like set up in this particular fashion, if they use it again, I think that would be effective. And he had that very fast firing style, that really fast like gambling firing style, which it clearly seems to be the way that a lot of the AWPers do try to use it, unless they are the Guardian Skadoodle set stable AWPer type guy. So I think he could be effective. I still think it's the case, and I can't wait to see what happens on this mTw team, even though at the moment we still don't know enough players and it might just be a veterans team. But if he applies himself, there's at least some potential for something interesting to happen there. So that's who Sunde is. Thanks to Alpha Draft.